Hello, all. Welcome to the Wax Museum. I'm Livwat, and I'm here with Brad Walker once again for part 3 of Sapiens.
Hello.
Welcome, Brad.
Welcome. Thank you much.
So today we're talking about the scientific revolution. We've gone through the first two, which were the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution. I'm going to read that quote that I've read in every episode. So we'll start with that. That's fine. Three important revolutions shaped the course of history. The cognitive revolution kick-started history about 70,000 years ago. The agricultural revolution sped it up about 12,000 years ago. The scientific revolution, which got underway only 500 years ago, may well end history and start something completely different.
Yeah.
Woo! This is fun.
Scientific revolution. And that kind of does just take us into his next book as well, which is kind of about the future of humanity and what we can do with all of the knowledge and power that we've gained through the scientific revolution.
That's so interesting. Have you started on that book at all?
I have started that book. I haven't finished it yet. I kind of got taken off of that and onto other books, but
well, it kind of makes me wonder too, like whether he would think differently about that book given what's happened in the world with COVID, because there's a lot about data and, like tracking people, like contact tracing and just the freedom. But anyways, that's a whole different topic. Maybe we'll have to do another episode.
Well, and I mean, I guess like that quote, the scientific revolution, it's not that the scientific revolution is causing this, right? The scientific revolution is simply just thinking. Basically, and this kind of really ties into Christianity, the scientific revolution was essentially just going from the idea that all knowledge was contained in a book, or that everything that was known or could be known was already known, and you just needed to listen to, the past, and like everything was already known. And we switched that into not trusting ourselves to say, like, no, there's a lot more that we can know. There's a lot more that we don't know. We used to think that we knew everything, and the scientific revolution is really just admitting that, no, we don't know anything. There is so much more to discover and to learn about the nature of the world. And that's the scientific revolution. It became more formalized, peer review, those types of things. But at the core of science revolution, that it's just a thought.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because and I don't know like what it actually looked like for believers at that time, like whether they actually thought that they knew everything or that everything they that was true was contained in the book. I know like some people are that way and some people were that way, but like realistically, like for me anyways, what faith is like delving into mystery. And it's not about like, oh, no, it's all, there's a simple answer for everything. It's like, no, there's not a simple answer for everything. Yeah. Just as with science, it's like, it's complicated. I don't really understand what's going on. And like with science, it's kind of like you have this notion that humans will understand all eventually. If we just keep pursuing it, we will find it. And for me, it's like, I'm going to pursue it. I'm never going to find it, but it's like, it's infinite. And so I'm just going to keep delving into it, not expecting I'm going to reach it. But I think almost like with science, it's like, well, I think we need about 5 more billion years and then maybe we'll have it all figured out. Like it's not, I don't think there's any like, oh, we're going to reach this next year. We're going to understand everything. Right. So I think there's still like, if you do either, the right way, you should have a level of humility and understanding that it's like, wow, I still got a lot to figure out. So I know one of the things he said is that, scientific revolution indicated that mere observations are not enough. They need to be connected to comprehensive theories. And I think that's really what this journey has been over the last 500 years is like, we're trying to come up with comprehensive theories for different things.
Yeah, it's just trying to explain, right? You say, well, I think that, this causes this, or this is this way. And in order to prove that, I'm going to test it. You kind of make predictions. If I do this, then I would expect this to happen. If I do this, I'd expect this to happen. If I do this, I would expect this to happen. And if that all lines up, then your theory has support and it grows. There is no end to science. It's kind of inconceivable. The idea, like science, again, is just an idea. It's an idea that you can learn about the world, that if you develop a hypothesis and you test it, and it's more the notion that, like a lot of people, when you're having arguments, they're not willing to change their mind. Like they're not open to changing their minds. But if you ask a scientist, like, what would it take for me to get you to change your mind? And the answer is always evidence. Just show me and I'll change my mind. I only believe the things that I believe because there's evidence to support it. If you think I'm wrong and you can show me evidence, there you go. I have a new theory and we'll move on to that.
That's so interesting, because I've been stuck on that notion of the elephant and rider. And I'm pretty sure I touched on this in the previous episodes. The idea that intuition is the elephant and our rationalization is the rider. And it's just a human condition. And it's like science is designed to stop that from happening. But I think at some level it still does happen. Like when you talk about stuff like climate change, and you got a scientist that's like, I don't think this is anthropomorphic, that guy doesn't get a whole lot of attention, does he? And is that because his science is bad? Or do you think that there actually is, a lot of, like, that's kind of already decided and they're not ready to have that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, specifically with climate change, it's a bit tricky because it's political. And there's agencies where their mandate is to document and determine how, man is affecting the climate. So it's impossible for them to conclude that we are not, because their whole existence is to prove that we are. So
and I find that one fascinating too. I read this book that was talking, and I can't remember what it's called. I'll find the book and I'll put it in the show notes. But it was talking about the practicality of dealing with climate change. And one of the things that the author used as an argument to prove that anthropomorphic climate change is feasible. And I can't believe I said anthropomorphic without screwing it up. That's amazing.
We're anthropogenic.
Now I've ruined it. No, but one of the things she talked about, and I think it was Mount St. Helens, where there was like ash that was spouted out, and it actually affected the Earth's atmosphere by a couple degrees. And she was like saying that, like, if that ash can do that, it makes sense that our 500 years, let's say, of pollution could change the temperature of the Earth by a couple degrees. And so I was like, that sounds very feasible to me.
It's a little bit weird, right? Because people used to talk about global warming, and they've abandoned that term, and it's now just climate change. And I don't think most people know, but like the time that we live in right now is referred to as an interglacial period, a period between ice ages. So, and the world has the world is actually really delicately balanced. You can't change any one thing without affecting everything else.
Right.
So it's one of those things where if you increase CO2, the world will react and it will use that CO2, and you'll have more vegetation. I'm not saying climate change is good or that we shouldn't control pollution, but my take would be more like conservationist, and don't pollute the waters, don't pollute the air, don't do things that are bad, but really complicated high level carbon taxing or cap and trade or different things, you're focusing on just one thing, and it kind of distracts from polluting rivers and actual air pollution and actual smog and particulates and things that we can do to really improve the planet that we live in. Like if you have big companies and they cap and trade, or it's all on paper, right? They're not actually doing something that is actually helping. Like, well, we have zero carbon footprint, and you bought credits from some polluter. It's like, well, like, let's just not pollute.
Well, I think, like, this is where the politics just ruins everything, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think, and I say this a lot, and I was going to say this before we started recording, because you were talking a little bit about how Christianity is intertwined with all of this and you can't really separate it. And I was like thinking, yeah, but it's like a tainted form of Christianity. And I really believe that, like, when you mix religion with politics, you end up with a compromised religion and a compromised politics.
You end up with something different, right?
Yeah.
Compromise, but it's just different. And
But I
yeah, like,
almost
to
think
say that Christianity, like, you can't look at it without, it's not to say that Christianity is bad or responsible for
Right.
good or bad, but like like European history, it was the church.
it was the driving force.
There wasn't
between
church and state. It was all together,
Mhm.
and everybody was Christian, essentially.
Yeah.
There weren't people that were like, oh, I don't really go to church. It's like, what? No, like, you wouldn't survive
You're a witch.
in medieval times without, you would be burnt at the stake. You would be a heretic. You would not, it wasn't possible to, sort of speak up against the church. But that's what Luther did. Like, the Protestant Reformation started the process towards the scientific revolution, towards like individual liberties. That and the French Revolution, like, without those, you wouldn't really have a scientific revolution. Like, it laid the groundwork for allowing the scientific revolution. And and one of the things that Luther did was to say, like, kind of an attack on the authority of the church, of the Pope itself or himself, to say, like, no, like, I can have a relationship with God. Like, I don't this. So in, like, what Luther's, whatever his manifesto, if you want to call it, is a step towards saying that, it's not all in the Bible, that there is, like, we can learn about others. There is something above just, like, papal authority, right?
Yes.
We don't have to be subject to that. So it's a little bit of an individual revolution, a little bit towards the scientific revolution. But that's why I kind of think, like, it's the scientific revolution didn't just happen with Copernicus, right? He existed at a time that allowed that to occur.
Well, and it's interesting too, because, like, you look at, like, the Catholic Church, it was like the Pope was the final authority. And then you move from that to evangelicalism, that was kind of like saying that the Bible is the final authority. And then you move from that to, like, people that are more progressive Christians, like Keith Giles, who I had on the podcast, where he says, well, no, it's Jesus that's the final authority, and he works outside of the Bible, right? But where I kind of wanted to jump from this was, I was thinking, already about how that intertwining of religion and politics, but I think we're seeing an intertwining of science and politics then, from what you're saying.
Sure.
And it's compromising the science, isn't it? Like, it's kind of looking at it and saying, okay, well, cap and trade or carbon tax, problem solved. And it's like, nothing to see here, folks. We got Saudi oil. It's like,
with modern science, like, where it interplays is, like, in patents, right? Like, drug companies, they spend a lot of money to develop drugs, and they have patents. They have 10-year patents, 20-year patents, whatever it is. And those types of things are kind of negotiated, right? Some government will come in and say, like, oh, we want to reduce patents so that we have more generic drugs and cheaper drugs and help people. But at the same time, without, the money that the pharmaceutical companies can make, we don't have new drugs, because you can't develop drugs for free. And there's also universities. It's like a public institution. So their knowledge, and if they develop something in a public institution, it's public knowledge. But there's a lot of private companies that are doing things and developing their own technologies. So they are doing science, but it's not science that's going to benefit society broadly, other than just, we have an Apple iPhone now.
Yeah.
But the technology, they guard that technology very tightly, right? So they're not kind of giving it to the world so that everybody can just use this technology and benefit from it. They lock it down, they control it, they make you pay. It's not that they're bad, but there is a difference when you start doing sort of science private and public.
Yeah.
It's actually an interesting tie into COVID too, because there's, from what I can tell, a pretty unprecedented level of sharing of scientific knowledge. People aren't like kind of keeping the data and like using it for their own purposes. It's a lot of just like, here, data, go. All of the research, they're sharing information, which is good. If you have 100 people developing vaccines, if it's better if they're all working together, right?
It's crazy times because I think this is something that the general public is really struggling to process, is like this idea that it's like, okay, don't wear a mask, it's a bad idea. And then it's like, nope, you need to wear a mask, it's a good idea. And then it's like, well, person to person transmission from someone who is asymptomatic, it's a low risk. Actually, well, no, you should wear a mask just in case. And it's just so interesting how like in our realm, you know, things changing. We're like, oh yeah, no, new data came in, and people are like, why don't they make up their minds? And it's like they would rather just be given an answer and someone just stick to their guns, you know, like they typically do in politics. It's like, well, I said this, therefore I have to stick to my guns, you know?
Well, and they get the like the gotcha journalism kind of thing where it's like, oh, like 2 months ago you said this. Well, yeah, like a scientist would answer, well, yeah, two months ago I thought that, and now I think this. What's your point?
Exactly.
And I've had conversations with like, oh man, they're flip flopping, going back and forth, and I kind of read or listen to it and go, the message has always been the same. They were just saying different things for different purposes, right?
Yeah.
Initially, they didn't want a run on medical masks because they needed them in hospitals, and they didn't know how many they would need. So they were like, you don't need to wear a mask, just, you know, social distancing, stay home, that's the best thing. But they didn't kind of tell you why they were asking you to do this or why they were saying one thing over another. And I think a lot of times, yeah, you read the headlines, it's like, don't wear a mask. It's like, well, if you read the whole article, you would see that they're telling you that they don't go out and start hoarding masks or toilet paper or anything else, really.
Exactly. So I really like this. So basically, Harari says that the best minds were busy giving meaning to death, not trying to escape it. So this is pre-scientific revolution. They were more focused on giving meaning to death and say, oh, no, it's okay, you'll have an afterlife. And then something shifted. And for men of science, death is not an inevitable destiny, but merely a technical problem. That's such a big shift in thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, it's tough. What was the first part of that?
For men of science, death is not an inevitable destiny, but merely a technical problem.
No, the distinction between, and it's a thought I'm kind of having where religion, yeah, it tells you this life is short. It doesn't matter. It's all about the afterlife. And it's kind of weird to live or to, like, we don't have like 16th century kind of medieval Europe. Everybody was Christian and everybody just kind of had that view. And I think having that view somehow makes individual rights less important. So there is kind of an interplay there where, you know, we started having more individual liberties, more individual freedoms. And then the idea that, you know, started getting in that maybe there isn't an afterlife. Maybe this is all we have. And if this is all you have, then I guess it does become a bit more important. And you have individual rights. Like it's more like you have to, it's up to you to live your life the way you want to live it, as opposed to you are just a cog in the machine. You're going to harvest wheat for me. You're going to go to this church. You're going to do this. And you're just that, right? You don't have choices. You're not given individual freedoms or liberties. I
I
think
think
it tied in a little bit with that.
what's really interesting too is like how people of different belief systems have different ideas of what living life to its fullest looks like. Because when you got someone that's like straight up a hedonist, they're just like, oh yeah, eat whatever I want, do whatever feels good, like it's kind of like that idea. Whereas, someone who's more, I guess, more of a humanist would think whatever's best for humanity, like let's further humanity, and I think like when you talk about like religion, I mean, there's good religion and there's bad religion, right? And there's bad religion where it's just like you need to use the right words and that's all we care about. And I'll kill you if you don't use the right words versus, a good religion where it's actually saying, look out for your fellow man and be, self-sacrificing for people. Like it's, and so, recognizing that every human should have dignity. And it's like, and I've thought a lot about like how fond I am of humanism. It's like if you're not going to have any kind of belief in a higher power, I'm like, humanism is awesome because it's just like for the betterment of humanity. And it's like that's a great way to live. And I'm like,
Yeah,
I can live like a humanist and believe in God. Like
it's a word I would call myself, a humanist,
Mhm, mhm.
objectivist humanist. Yeah, that's Ayn Rand's philosophy, really, coming in talking about humanism. Yeah, no, that sounds good to me. But with religions, there aren't good religions and bad religions. It's two sides of the same coin. All religions are good and bad throughout history, in every conceivable situation, essentially.
Depending on how people practice them, you mean?
Well,
Mhm.
it's both good and bad.
Yeah.
Even the idea of like encouraging self-sacrifice, if you're a humanist, that's objectionable. You should not
Mm.
sacrifice yourself to something. The idea, like I'm an individualist, so I would be against collectivist notions. So the idea that like I am a Canadian, therefore I have to do something because I'm Canadian. Like, there's this identity. It's like, no, I'm
Mhm.
just an individual.
Right.
I'm not white, I'm not male, I'm not, just like I'm a human. That's it.
I
If
guess
there
when
was a
I'm
box to check wherever they go down I would check human or write in other human. That's what I am.
but I'm not talking about like self-sacrifice for a cause so much as like the way you would self-sacrifice for your child, right?
Yeah.
Or to help another person, or like the
Yeah.
idea that someone's drowning in a lake and you're like, well, I don't really want to go in that lake, but I'm going to do what I can to rescue that person even though it's very convenient and I really need to get to work, right? And it's
Yeah.
just
Like
it's kind of that
that's,
mentality that sometimes we inconvenience ourselves for others out of love.
yeah. And it's not like incompatible with a humanist
No, it's
philosophy.
not.
Yeah, like it's rational self-interest, and even with like our children, like that's a biological desire as well.
Hmm.
But I mean, it's you're doing it for yourself. It's something that you want. You're not really sacrificing. I mean, it's the idea of the military idea, right? Where I'm gonna go and sacrifice myself for the country. That
Hmm.
notion doesn't exist for a humanist. It's
Right.
awful. The
Right.
idea that you should sacrifice yourself, self-immolation. It's awful. I mean,
Mm.
it's you can see it in people and you can encourage it, and we do need to have compassion and help people, but not true sacrifice. Like altruism is the opposite of a humanist or individual type philosophy.
Hmm. How would you define altruism?
It's well, it's sacrificing oneself for others.
Hmm.
It's doing something for others.
Which is a very Christian kind of way of looking at things.
Yeah, like I don't know who
Hmm.
was saying this, but he was talking about just like the fundamental of the foundations of Christianity, the idea that that Jesus Christ, who was pure,
Hmm.
free of sin,
Hmm.
did nothing, was crucified, was sacrificed for others. The idea that like if you do something, I'll kill somebody else as punishment, or like he'll pay your crimes, is awful. And the way he wrote it out, it was just like, it's kind of like really a bad grounding for a philosophy to think that, that's good. Sacrifice to others is good. He was like, no, it's not good. We should each live like rational self-interest, like each live for ourselves. That's how everybody is going to be better. If everybody has to sacrifice everything to everyone else, no one has anything, right?
Well, I think like something like that though is more so along the lines of willingly giving something up. It's not, the expectation is, and
Yeah.
I think when we talk about like sacrifice for people, or I guess altruism is something that it's like, it's shocking when people do it for you, and it's like, well, the guy that misses, ends up late for work because he rescued that person out of that lake, right? And it's like, well, he didn't have to do it, but he did it. Although it's kind of humanly expected that at some level we're not just going to let someone die in a lake out
No,
of our
nobody
convenience,
can.
right?
It's
Yeah.
like, we are social beings. We evolved
Hmm.
very strong social desires, and we help others that need our help where we can. That's absolutely it.
Yeah. So basically, Harari argues that modern science and capitalism were the driving force that allowed Europe to dominate. And Europe, unlike other empires, were exploring to find new knowledge and territories, not just power and wealth. So there was a quest for knowledge that really drove the expansion of empire.
Yeah, I guess my note on that one was kind of to say that's sort of ostensibly what was happening. Um, they were imperialists. They were looking
Mhm.
for treasures and new worlds to exploit. The kind of the first people who show up are like cartographers or people like Darwin, and they analyze everything, but then they go back and report, and the people who paid for those expeditions go,
Mm,
great, let's go take all that gold and kill all those people you found.
right. So there's people behind it that are financing it that are like, okay, so where's the profit?
Yeah, it's power. So yeah, science has kind of, well, knowledge is power, right? That's a kind of a truism, and science leads to knowledge. So science leads to power, and so those who have power will seek to use science for their own benefits in any way they can.
So I thought this was really interesting. So we were talking about like imagined order, I think, in the first two episodes, anyways. And this I found really interesting. Banks loan $10 for every dollar they possess. So basically, it's imaginary value. Actually, very similar to all this COVID money that the government is giving people, right? It's imagined money. It's not. It doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, and that's like they're like leveraging, right? Like they say basically there's probably not going to be a run on the banks, so you can give out more than you have.
Hmm.
It's really not it's really no different than, you have a mortgage on your house because you couldn't afford it all.
Yes.
So you can take that money and you can, loan it out to somebody else, and you can just based on having your house, you could multiply the value of your house and then start loaning out to people and say, as long as everybody keeps paying me, this is all good. If everybody asks for their money back, I will fail. And
Yeah.
banks do fail, and or rather they should fail. But yeah, they get bailed out with sort of more. And that's actually imaginary money. That's not like money is an intersubjective reality. There's a dollar, I give it to you. We agree it's on something. But when you start getting into like trillions of dollars of debt, and like, yeah, it is kind of imaginary. And I don't know where it's coming from.
Yeah. And so like credit enables us to build in the present at the expense of the future. And that's
Yeah.
basically what much of our economy is based on, right? Like it's like
Yeah.
we are.
Perpetual growth,
Mhm.
right? We always want growth. We always want inflation and growth. Um, if a company that's really successful came out and said, you know what, next year we are going to make just as much money as we made this year, people would sell their stock. They'd be like, what do you mean? You're not going to grow? You're just going to stay the same?
Yeah.
So yeah. But yeah, and credit is a really huge revolution as well in money. And the idea of credit, because that created a really big expansion, sort of into individuals and then corporate. But now we're just doing it with nation states, which is a little bit scary.
Yeah, it is. So Adam Smith, his kind of thinking was, if I am rich, you too will be rich because you can now sell me something. All of this depends on the rich opening up new factories and hiring new employees rather than wasting money on non-productive activities.
Yeah, and I mean, different companies will have different setups, but in general, it's competition that drives innovation. It's one company wanting to have a bigger market share or a better product or a cheaper product, and companies go in different routes all the time. When you have like really sort of non-productive activities, you probably have some type of political interference, paperwork, the sort of Trumps of the world will just call it red tape or environmental laws or environmental legislation or this or that. So that's kind of where you get into sort of the non-productive. There's also non-productive where people just hoard a whole bunch of cash. Like Apple has a ridiculous amount of cash and it's not doing anything. But again, you could blame politics on that as well because they just don't want to pay tax on it. That's why.
I am becoming like more and more disenfranchised with politics. Like it's just like the more I think about it, I'm like, yeah, I can't vote for those guys. Can't vote for those guys. I don't like those guys either. Okay, I'll pick these people. And then you pick the people and then they do stupid stuff anyways. And I'm just like, you know what? I don't like any of these people. Like, why am I casting a vote? Like and I mean, I know, you know, if you vote, then you can't complain or whatever. But I'm just like, you know what? Like, I just don't like any of the choices.
No, I don't either. I was actually, I did a air quality test for somebody. And so it's a 2-hour test. So I basically just sit around and talk with them for 2 hours.
Yes.
So they were concerned about like dust and residues, but I did like a chemical sample. Anyway, I'm not sure how the conversation started, but they were kind of like, well, I'm not sure what your views are, but they were like really big Trump supporters. I was just like, oh, like, I mean, well, I'm a founding member of the People's Party of Canada, card-carrying member of the Conservative Party of Canada, and proud Liberal supporter and voter. They're like, I'm like, well, that's me. I mean, they were the best. Like, Harper's out, that's good. But yeah, like the Liberals, that was me. Like, their campaign, what they said they would do, I think is great. But I don't think that what they, like, it was modest deficit spending with a focus on infrastructure. And they went in and doubled, I think, what they were kind of suggesting with no plan to kind of rebalance the budget and kind of just abandoned the idea that a balanced budget is a good idea.
That was the first time they came to power.
Yeah, right? That was the first election.
Yeah, second term, it was like, I'm not even sure what they promised. I just remember Justin Trudeau in the canoe, and I'm like, this is dumb.
Yeah. Well, yeah, for the first one, they had the majority, right? Now we don't, right?
Yeah. No, it's a minority now. But because we have no parliament, they can still do whatever they want. It's see, politics, dumb. Okay, so
everybody, to me, everybody is talking at the wrong level. Like, I don't know if I'm left or right.
No.
But I'm about freedoms and individual liberties, and I don't think people really talk about that. They want fancy boutique tax credits and kind of more government control, right? People want the government to control every aspect of their lives, essentially.
Well, we're in a crazy time for that too, though, right? Yeah. Because it's like we've shut down the economy. and now we're starting to restart the economy. But it's like, okay, but like, what happens to all these small businesses that cratered and all that, right? So it's just messy. But like to me, I think with a lot of this, I really think innovation is the thing. We all need to figure out, like, we need to figure out how to innovate and restructure and take advantage of this. Like it's not, I think, like rather than sitting and saying, well, I'm just going to take the government money or whatever, it's like, well, let's figure out how we can use whatever we've got, and whether it's government money or whether we've been able to save, it's like, let's find an opportunity in the midst of COVID. And I mean, that's pretty easy to do as an industrial hygienist. Like I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, okay, people need to figure out how to deal with this new COVID reality. Okay, well, I'm going to help people with that. And it's like, but if you're like a hairdresser, or I don't know, a tattoo artist, or you make movies, or you have a movie theater, like there's things that they have to really rethink their job. If you're a restaurant, you can only go to 50% capacity. So how do you change your business model? I mean, it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
I know, like, really though, the key is with restaurants is figuring out how to do, have people come pick up food, having people, um, order out and all that, right? Like delivery. And I mean, you just have to, like, we have to innovate, and that's what's going to get us out of this.
Yeah, I think a lot, like from my perspective, to me, it's like this is a thing that happens. It's always happened. We've always had infections that spring up. They kind of go through their normal course and they're gone, mostly. The response to this has been a little bit weird.
Mm-hmm.
I've been trying to think of like other examples, and I haven't really gone through it. And maybe with you, I need to do some research again. But like we had SARS, we had MERS, H1N1, and some of those, like SARS, was much more lethal, but not as transmissible or not as easily transmitted. So we kind of haven't had the perfect storm. But why was this response so powerful? And how did essentially all of the world's countries agree to impose these restrictions on liberties? There's a quote, I don't know who it is, I'll probably butcher it, but it's like, those who will give up some freedoms for liberty understand neither and deserve neither, right? Like people, it's kind of shocking to me how willing people are to give up their freedoms. Like they're like, oh, the government says everything's locked down, I can't go anywhere. They just go, okay. As opposed to going, hey, wait a minute, like I'm an individual and I have a right to go out and I have a right to, work and make my money and provide for my own way. And you can't just tell me like I have to shut down my store because I want to cut someone's hair. Like if somebody wants to come into my store and I'm going to cut their hair for money, where is the government involved? Why are you telling me I can't do that? Right? My thing is the government should have put out good information from the start and told people how they should behave. To me, the biggest protector in all of this is just individuals kind of being respectful of people. Protesters and Nazis punching police aside, I go into a store, people are keeping their distance, they're being respectful, there's little dots, there's just like a little extra space between somebody, and that's good. I think restaurants could have from the start maintained a 50% seating capacity, or done something like that. Or nail salons, it's like maybe every third chair we can still have clients, but sorry, we're going to have to charge you twice as much because we have half the space now.
Right.
And if you're willing to go to a salon and pay twice as much, that's your right, and it's their right to continue to work.
Well, and that's what it looks like coming back. That's what we have to do now coming back. And I think, like looking back, like, could we have done it that way from the get-go? I guess that's the question, right? And I think with a lot of this too, it's like um a lot of this is going to be clearer in hindsight, but it also won't be, because it's like I keep comparing it to like the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because you're just like, well, yeah, I don't think we needed to do that, but it's like, but what would have happened if we didn't do that? And it's like, well, we'll never know. And so, I mean,
Yeah,
there'll always be people that say we should have done that,
yeah,
and we did what we had to. And then there's going to be people that are like, yeah, we did the wrong thing. But then, like, well, if that's the wrong thing, then what was the right thing, right?
yeah.
And
So
so,
yeah, in war times, I guess it's a bit different, but
yeah,
that's kind of like Trump just kind of claimed that he was a wartime president in response or because of COVID, and
yes,
like during times of war, that's where we kind of acknowledge that there are going to be like
the
our
invisible enemy.
freedoms and liberties get taken away.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
conscription. There is really, you don't get to have your rights. Um, and I guess we are kind of like at war with COVID. We kind of have suspended normal order, and we've given up our rights and freedoms for a period to try and see if we can keep everyone from dying, which is good.
So,
But I think that people, like, if you give them I think for the most part, people are smart. I've said this before, and I've had people claim that no, they don't think that people are generally smart. But I think that if you had given people good information, like none of this, like you don't need to wear a mask, like the answer should have been, you should wear. It would obviously help, because this is gonna, like, sneezing on everybody in a store, bad
bad.
practice,
Yeah.
right? Wearing a sneeze guard in front of your face, therefore helps. Is it
Hmm.
100%?
Hmm.
No, nothing is 100%.
No.
Just give people really good information, teach them, educate them, and if businesses can develop a way that they can stay open or maintain services or do this and that, let them. It was a little
Hmm.
bit weird because if you essential services are allowed to stay open, and then you read essential services from the government, and everything is essential. Everything except for retail, basically, and movie theaters and sporting arenas. But fishing was still going on, any type of repair or maintenance work, anything that supports like animals, like there's still veterinary clinics and like that, none of that
Hmm.
is shut down.
Hmm.
So it's not fair for the government to just kind of be like, hey, you keep your job, you lose yours, you have to do
Pick
this,
the
you can't
winners
do
and
this.
losers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the government shouldn't be picking winners and losers. They shouldn't
Hmm.
be doing anything really. They should just be there um, to kind of be like, I think the public health officials did a really good job for the most part. I mean, I'm Manitoba. I think our public health officials were really smart. They kept us
Yeah.
on ball. Our province, I mean, we have a low population density, but um, it never really got bad here.
I think we came out all right in Alberta too. Um, yeah. So
But yeah,
it's
that's,
so hard not to talk about COVID. It's so funny how
yeah,
that just kind
yeah.
of it's
Try to tie it in, right?
yeah.
Uh,
But I mean, it's a fact of life, right? And so what do you think that there are freedoms that you lost that you're not going to get back right now?
uh, well, no, I guess not. I mean, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. I guess right now, when people are being told like you can't do this, you can't do that, there's interference. That's I'm not allowed to pursue happiness. I can't, if I can't go get a haircut or go get a
Mm,
tattoo, do what I want. That's denying me my right to the pursuit of happiness, to live life the way I want to live it. So for right now, yeah, that right essentially has been taken away. But
would
it's
you want to go to for a
not,
tattoo right now though?
huh?
Like, would you be comfortable getting a tattoo right now? Or would you just be like, you know what? I'll wait until things die down a bit more?
I would ask the same questions I ask all of the people I go see, right? Like, how are you feeling? Or do you have any flu-like symptoms? Have you traveled?
Hmm.
Like, I mean, if you
What are
go
you
in to
doing to
if you
protect
go in
me?
to
Yeah.
get a tattoo and the guy that's going to be working on you has a runny nose and he's sick and
Yeah.
he's sweaty and he's clearly not well, you leave.
Yeah.
And and everybody around him would already have told him to go back home because clearly he's sick and they don't want him there. There has been, I think I could say maybe 10, 20 years, an increasing level of it. Used to be like, suck it up, go to work. Like, oh, I
Yes.
called in
Yes.
sick. Like, you
Yeah.
weren't that sick. You can come into work. You can still do your work. And it changed to, if you're sick, the best thing you can do is stay home. And that's still
Hmm.
that's fundamentally the COVID advice has been that. Like, if you're sick,
Yeah.
stay home. And if everybody who was sick stayed home, you might still have some asymptomatic transmission and everything, but you really wouldn't get like these massive epidemics where, you know, you're running the risk of having hospitals not able to keep up.
So, so back to economy. What I found really interesting is this development of investors and how multiple investors leads to less risk for the individual investor. And I'm like, what an innovation that was. And I've never really thought too much about that till I read this book. And I guess I'm just not an economist because it's like, that's such an obvious thing. But I'm like, so basically you take all that risk and you spread it out over multiple individuals.
Yeah, it's insurance, right? There's insurance for yourself, but you're generally better off in group insurance because your risk is spread throughout the group. The initial like insurance was essentially like fire insurance. Basically, the community all got together and said like, any of our houses can burn. Let's all just put in a pool, and if any of our houses burn, you'll get a new house, right? And that was insurance. It's
Hmm.
pooled risk.
Yeah.
Um, there's lots of advantages to pooling all kinds of like even like mutual funds, right? That was the idea. It's like, well, why buy just one company when you can buy a whole bunch of them and have somebody, you know, like you are reducing the risk. One thing can happen and you don't lose it all.
Hmm. So you also went a little bit into credit ratings for countries. And it's like it includes the probability that a country will pay its debts. So a country that's devoid of natural resources, which enjoys peace, a fair judicial system, and free government, is likely to receive a high credit rating. Which
Yeah.
makes you wonder, like, what are credit ratings looking like now when you consider how really every country has become, at some level, a socialist state, right? With like the bailing out of individuals that have been unemployed, right?
Yeah. Well, and like in 2007, 2008, that financial collapse, it was essentially because of the ratings system, the bureau. They were essentially incompetent and were just rating things based on what somebody else had done or on some other formula, and they were giving insurance or financial products credit ratings that they didn't understand.
Hmm.
It got so confused, so convoluted, so complex that even the ratings agencies didn't know what they were actually rating. And with companies or countries, it ends up being really political. And the problem is that as soon as a country looks like it might have hard times, you lower their rating, which increases what they have to pay. So if
Hmm.
you're paying 6% and you kind of go like, yeah, you have your mortgage, it's 4%, you go to your bank, you're like, you know what? Times are really tough. I'm having trouble making these payments. They'd be like, great, now you're paying us 7%.
Yeah.
And that, so because we rate you less now.
That's
So
similar to,
it ends up being pretty politically loaded, I think, too. And the rating agencies are likely quite incompetent.
because that reminds me of like, I remember when Bush was in power in the States, Bush Jr., he, W. Bush, nobody calls him Bush Jr., but um,
The little one.
he, he was like funding schools based on their test results. And so the schools that got good test results would get more money, which is like, well, that just gives you like this perpetual system where the good get better.
Well,
And
and not only that, but it's the people who do the best on that test. It's not the better schools, right?
yeah, exactly.
Standardization it's a trick, right? You'll have people that literally study nothing but that test. They're like, this
Yeah.
whole course, it's a course on how to ace the normal test or
Yeah.
so it doesn't work. It's not a really good idea.
Yeah.
But to me, that's an example of just unintended consequences and an argument that the government should do as little as possible, because when they try to do something, they tend to do it wrong, and that the unintended consequences are always greater than the intended consequences.
So like so back to kind of like the free market kind of mentality then, if a single corporation controls the shoe industry, shoemakers cannot protect themselves by switching jobs. Um, do you think like monopolies just don't happen if the government doesn't intervene, or
Correct.
is it's not possible for a monopoly to form
It's
if
not.
the government's
No,
interesting?
it just really isn't. Um, you can look at a lot of, like, Google. Is Google a
Mhm.
monopoly? No. It just happens to be super dominant. But
Hmm.
there are competitors,
There's
there
still
are options,
alternatives.
and in 10 years, it might not be Google that's at the top.
That's yeah, because the government hasn't really done anything
They're kind
with
of
that, have they?
anti-Google, actually.
Hmm.
But
So
yeah,
one
no,
of
there is no monopoly without government coercion.
yes, I've always wondered about that, and it's funny because like anybody I talk to on free market is like, yeah, no, it wouldn't happen, and I'm like, interesting. And Harari seems to give some pushback on that, doesn't he? Like he said, the slave trade was created because of supply and demand. Like that's what drove it. Is the idea that like, and so what would stop it?
Well, like, I mean, yeah, slavery, it it was, I mean, part of the arc of history of increasing levels of individual freedoms, of all that kind of thing, like the French Revolution. I mean, it's somewhat hard to go through the French Revolution and then go out and, use slaves. But
Mm,
basically, that was one battle won, one battle lost. So there were no more feudal serfs, and people started having individual freedoms. But there's, like last time, I think I said, yeah, farming is hard work. People generally hire farmhands,
mm-hmm.
and if you can not pay somebody, if that's allowed, then yeah, then you would own slaves, because why
Yeah.
wouldn't you?
But I guess in the end, it wasn't so much government as it was societal pressure because we
It's
were
just
like, hey, we can't be doing this anymore. And eventually
they
our
didn't give
society evolved
individual
to the
rights
point.
to those slaves. They did not give them individual rights. They saw them as a commodity, as a
Right.
product that could
Right.
be bought and sold. And it still happens, but just less so, perhaps.
More so in the sex industry, really.
It happens all over.
Yeah.
There's active slave markets in Libya,
Mm-hmm.
like now, people
Hmm.
being bought and sold into slavery.
So awful.
Yeah. The thing with the book that to me, it was mind boggling, is that it was like the Dutch had bonds. So you could be, a shopkeeper working and living in the city, and part of your investment portfolio was slave bonds.
Hmm.
You would be getting money trickling in from companies whose business it was to go and trade in slaves, and you would gladly collect their the interest or the dividends paid off of that.
Hmm.
And that it was like organized like that, like it wasn't just some guy went out on a ship and took some slaves and was making cash and hoarding it for himself. This was organized. There was bonds, there was bankers and financial people looking at and reviewing these bond offerings for slave owners. It's that, to me, is sort of mind boggling.
It's crazy too, because I mean, like, I think about this, like, in our realm, industrial hygiene. You think about, like, you watch old YouTube videos of like people wearing asbestos sweaters,
Yeah.
and you're just like, what the heck? And they're like, asbestos is like the wonder fiber, and then we discover just how nasty it is. And I think it took a while too for even like the science was saying that, you know, it was cancerous. And I'm sure big industry is like, can you not say that, right? As with anything else.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, like when I think about asbestos and I look at those old YouTube videos, I'm like, wow, well, that's really dumb. But I'm like, but it makes me wonder what's really dumb about us now.
Yeah.
And so from a human rights point of view, do you think there's things that we're doing today that is similar to what slavery was back then? And we're going to look, you know, our, you know, ancestors are going to be like, I can't believe those people did that.
Yeah. Marxism would be one. And really, nation states. I've been struggling with the idea, like we live in a increasingly globalized world. We have problems that are above any individual state. A lot of, like, even with climate change, like, oh, well, we're just Canada. Like, what can we do if China doesn't matter? It's like, well,
Right.
like I'm starting to see this pattern, like, and all of history. This is Harari's book from 12,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago to now. There's an arc of increasing levels of cooperation and unity between humans.
Yeah.
So I just kind of see that going towards, if you extend that out, there's one world order. I think of all of the inefficiencies where you have all these individual central banks and they all have their own currencies and they're all manipulating their currencies as a competition tactic. Like China manipulates its currency. We can't trust China, all this and that.
Yeah.
Trade tariffs, racism, building walls. Like, why don't we just tear them all down and call this planet world? And there is one world government. We have the World Health Organization, we have the UN, we have NATO, we have these agencies, these international agencies, and they're not all good or perfect, but I see us, like in say 100 years, kind of going, remember when we had nation states? Remember when we had borders drawn and people in Israel killed these people and these people killed these people? You know, like, it's the same thing with like that women didn't have rights, that women couldn't vote, that not everybody could vote. These ideas where we were like, what? How did that ever?
I like how, like, what you're saying is terrifying to a lot of people.
It's absolutely terrifying.
But I'm like, my thought too is that, you know, we look at even Canada and how, you know, like in Alberta, we suffer from Western alienation and we feel like Ottawa never hears us.
Yeah. Which is
And
political
so,
rhetoric.
but I do think that, like, there is something about localized government too, and giving power locally, just like, you know, in the United States, how each state has their own power, right? And it's like, so I see like a unifying kind of world. I guess I don't know what the word would be for it, but just kind of this,
Constitution?
yeah, some sort of a constitution that's like, let's do what's best for the world, but at the same time to recognize the individual, and at a community level make sure that people, you know, are working together to help each other, because you need kind of those like localized legislation or localized, you know, agreements to say, okay, well, we want to get our oil to market, and it's like the rest of the world doesn't really care what happens with Alberta's oil sands, but Alberta does. You know? And so, like, being able to give like a certain amount of power locally. And I you know, it's funny, I have a lot of people I've been talking to who are anarchists, and you know, when they talk about like really community based, you know, power, and it's like you own your own, you know, estate, and you control your own estate, and you interact with the other estates, but it's like you're responsible for your own estate. It's very individualistic, but it kind of works, you know, branches out into community, right? And it's not like, you know, where you have a strong nationalistic government that is trying to control everything and make everything uniform in, you know, a large landmass like Canada, at some level, you're just like, okay, you guys aren't hearing us like at all, right?
Well, and I think that, I guess, like my view of government, like the reason you see all those things or feel those things is because the government's doing something. If they weren't doing anything, then they're not, you know, oh, like, why are they giving money to Ottawa? It's like, well, stop giving away any money to anybody. Like, no more like Bombardier, like, don't bail out anybody, right? Just the government is there to ensure that we have our freedoms, that they can be realized. If somebody comes into my house to steal from me, the government steps in and puts that person in jail or determines some type of retribution. That's pretty much it. Anarchy doesn't work. It's the absence of a system. It's like nihilism. It's the destruction of everything. Nothing really comes out of it. I also had heard somebody refer to themselves as a minarchist, I think. It's
I've never heard that.
Really, it's like a step up above anarchy, where you're like, no, there needs to be something, but basically just police or national defense or like just that. But that's what I'm saying though is none of that can address climate change. None of that can address global issues.
Right.
And so
and
there does need to be something that contributes to something that's higher than our nation states. I mean, even the provinces, like we're better as a union. But you kind of take that philosophy and extend it, and you're like, well, then wouldn't it be better, like, instead of having the US, Mexico, and Canada free trade agreement, why don't we just call ourselves Canada, America, Mexico, like just all one country? Have the same baseline for rights, the same baseline for freedom of mobility, freedom of association, all of those things. But yeah, there's, to me, it's too top heavy. The higher the government, the smaller it should be. So the biggest government is your municipal government, the people who actually fix your streets and the versus the librarians, whatever it is. That should, like, most of public employees, most of government really should be at the local level, the actual dissemination of services. And Ottawa should just be a committee that sits together once a couple months and goes, everything okay? Do we need to change anything? No. Everybody still have freedom? Good. And just really not do much at all.
Yep, I totally hear you on that. And I mean, you see that from a business perspective too, because I mean, like, when you talk to anybody who works for a major corporation, and especially somebody, you know, that's your labor, because you and I deal with those level of people a lot, right? Or do you?
Yeah,
you know,
all kinds.
Those are the guys you're going to put a monitor on for the day, right? And you know, in industrial hygiene, I think, Google industrial hygiene people. But that's what I find is, like, you meet those people, and when it's a large corporation, you can sense there's a certain level of alienation for the worker, where they're like, you know what I don't like is how this is done. And you look at them and it's like, I don't know why you're complaining to me, but I mean, I never say that. I just like, that sucks. Anyways, what did you do today? Right. But it's like, as you get into smaller and smaller businesses, and I've noticed that going back to consulting again, I'm like, I feel like I have a level of control. I have a level of input. It's almost like this brings us back to, you know, how the agricultural revolution is the biggest scam of all time, Harari argues, because what happened is we became more of a cog in a machine. And I think this is kind of like an interesting way to kind of end this whole series, is that, like, we have become, you know, so much about growth that we're looking at quantity, not quality, for life. And it's like,
you were talking about science and how it was kind of moving. I forget what I was going to say now. No, you'll have to continue on. Keep talking, I'll remember it.
Okay. But it's like, so kind of getting back to that, you know, it's like when you work for a small business, it's almost like going back to being in that hunter-gatherer society, where it's like, yeah, it's kind of stressful because I don't always know where the work's coming from. But man, I have autonomy and I'm able to help us go in a direction. Whereas working for a larger company, I just got to go along with whatever momentum we already have, because I am not going to shift the direction of any of this.
Well, and I mean, some companies do really, it's, like job satisfaction, it's autonomy. The standard example is like somebody who just like puts the cog in and like on like piecework, just like I just move this part into this part, and they have like, they don't know what they're making. They have no idea what the end product is.
No meaning.
Versus you switching that process around and actually having one person actually responsible for the manufacture of a component, like right through, that person will have way more job satisfaction because they can actually see that they're benefiting. There is a tangible product that they're producing. It's just kind of human nature. We want to actually be productive. We want to know what we're doing, and we want to, be useful. So job satisfaction improves when people have autonomy. And there's some companies they have like anybody at any level of their organization, this giant manufacturing machine. If you see a problem, push stop. Anybody can stop this process anywhere along the way and tell us how we can do it better. And there's a lot of companies, and that's quality, like quality management, that they improve that innovation through. Toyota is that. Toyota in like Japan in the 70s sort of embraced quality and embraced this kind of philosophy, and they were successful because of it.
It's awesome.
Yeah. I had somebody today ask me, they're like, so what do you like, what's your title? And I was like, like, I don't want to say air quality specialist. You can call me like an industrial hygienist or hygienist. And they're like, well, that's weird. I was like, I'm like, those are the people that just go around and make sure everything's safe and orderly and ergonomics. It all kind of ties in. He's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I'm like, yeah, it's hard to explain though.
It is a crazy job title.
Yeah, it doesn't sound right. Hygienist. It's like, oh, you work at a dentist's office. No.
I like just saying like, I'm an industrial hygienist, and the person's like, oh yeah. It's like, you have no idea what I just said. All right. Well, I think we got through part of the book anyways, but it was interesting going through the different revolutions, and I cannot recommend that book enough. I think I'm going to have to read his next book. What is it called again?
Homo Deus.
Homo Deus.
So it's basically saying like Homo Part 2.
Okay.
Right? The idea is that
it's a crazy title.
With genetic engineering, like it's the first point in history where we can actually engineer ourselves. There's a difference between kind of like selective breeding, or even what we were doing with like in vitro fertilization. It's still just an egg, it's still just a sperm, but now we can actually go and like start changing whatever gene we want. And what do humans do with that technology, right?
Yeah, like that's so terrifying. But
you can give me slave labor and I will run with it.
Yeah.
What do we how do we end up using this technology?
It is something though we need to think about, because it's like before we think about it, we'll be there and all these decisions will already be made. So I think it's important that's another conversation that needs to be had. So we will do it when we're both done the book. But
sure.
Thank you for coming on.
Like instead of going to a continent and stealing slaves, you can just make them, clone them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Anyways, so Brad, a good way for our listeners to get a hold of you is on Facebook.
Yeah, Facebook can be the only way. Yeah, last time I said I don't have a book for sale, so.
Still no book, eh?
Yeah. Well, we should collaborate on one.
I would love to. We'll do that. All right. Well, thank you, Brad.
You're welcome.
And bye, everybody.
Air Smudge.